Confessions of a Deep Sea Diver by Pizza ND. I recently left my job as a deep sea diver. I worked for a large company that offers diving services ranging from salvage, underwater demolition, ship repairs, and search and recovery. They are a reputable company and are considered safe and reliable, so much that they are often contracted by the government. Truth be told, I miss working for them. The people I worked with were truly the best, but there are only so many unexplainable things that you can witness in the deep before you decide to stay out of the ocean, well, forever. Here are some examples of the secrets that many divers take to their graves. On the way to a job that we were contracted to perform, our propeller became fouled. I suited up and prepared to make a quick dive to remove the fouling. I did a brief inspection and located a thick line wrapped around the prop and the shaft. I notified the supervisor, who then lowered a canvas bag with the tools I would need to cut it off. I hung the bag from the shaft and began freeing the propeller. It didn't take long, and I returned to my tool bag. I noticed a strange crunching sound when I dropped my tools in the bag. When I looked in the bag, it was full of many large shells, many of which I had just crushed. After getting out of the water and stripping off my gear, I began examining them. The shells had what appeared to be hieroglyphics etched into them. I learned from one of the senior guys that this wasn't common, but had happened to several of them before. On another occasion, we were recovering a military aircraft. When we arrived, naval ships were on the scene waiting for us to recover it for them. We were quickly briefed that they had lost communication with the pilot and wanted us to recover it so they could investigate. I was sitting comms and logs. That's communication with the divers, monitor depths, bottom time, that kind of stuff. When the divers reached the project, they reported that the plane was intact. We were all kind of surprised. The supervisor asked how extensive the damage was. Then they explained it was completely intact, as in there was no visible damage at all. It was just resting on the bottom. Even stranger, the aircraft canopy was still in place. That means the cockpit is still sealed. In other words, the pilot did not eject. But there was no sign of the pilot at all. We recovered the plane and the military took custody of it. We never heard about it again. I witnessed another pretty strange occurrence from topside at the location of a planned demolition. It's necessary to explain that one way you keep track of a diver is to watch their bubble stream. When a diver inhales, the helmet's demand regulator provides air from their umbilical. When they exhale, it's exhausted into the water and floats up to the surface. On the top side, you can watch bubbles to get a general sense of where the divers are. Now, on this occasion, we were, hundreds of miles away from land, and we had placed 2 divers in the water. About roughly an hour into the dive, we started noticing that something strange was happening. There were 3 distinctive set of bubbles coming from where they were working at. At first we assumed it was the current that was affecting it, but soon we noticed a 4th set of bubbles coming from a distance. It stopped about 20 feet away from the divers, near the other mysterious bubbles. We asked the divers, but neither of them could see anything out of the ordinary. Then, even from the surface, we heard some blood-curdling screech from the waters. Then, silence. The divers weren't too concerned. We hear weird things all the time. Sound travels pretty well in water, and you assume that it's just a long distance away. But soon, it looked like the water at the distance was boiling, and it was getting closer. It wasn't boiling, though. It was countless new bubble streams moving nearer to the location where the divers were working. The supervisor ordered the divers to get into the dive stage and be lifted back to the surface. The bubbles were frighteningly close now. The divers were being lifted out. They said they began to see shadows and figures in the distance. They couldn't quite make out what they were, though. We elected to pull the divers out without completing their decompression stops, and just threw them into our hyperbaric chamber. During another dive near the Bahamas, I had a frightening experience. It was my first salvage job with them, so I got in with a highly experienced diver. At just over 200 feet deep, we were examining a sunken vessel for rigging points. As I approached the bow of the ship, I noticed that he was investigating a damaged portion of the hull. He swam a few feet into the ship looking around. I asked him a few times if he wanted me to tend to his umbilical, the air supply hose, from just outside the ship. It's highly advisable since it's dangerous to enter a sunken vessel. To which he stated, no. He didn't want to enter the ship. He insisted that he was on the port side of the ship. Assuming he was just disoriented, I reached to grab him, but just before touching him, I realized that there were no bubbles coming from the helmet. Whatever this was, it wasn't breathing. I backed up and reported that something else was down here. I expected mockery, but there was none. Then the next thing I heard was the diving supervisor. Both divers, square yourselves away and get ready to leave bottom. When back on the surface, I asked the supervisor about it. He said that he refused to put his divers in exceptionally dangerous situations. Then he refused to clarify. We declined to complete the salvage. I'm not entirely sure how to explain this next dive. I was on bottom, lying on my back staring up toward the surface. All I could see were these varying shades of darkness. Suddenly I came to my senses. I had no memory of how I got there. I realized that I couldn't remember getting into the water or even why I was there. I tried to will my body to stand up, but realized that I couldn't even move. I couldn't control my body. Over the comms, I could hear Topside instructing the other divers to find me. How long had I been down there? How long had I been missing? One of the divers told the Topside that they grabbed him. I tried to shout out, but I couldn't even do that. After a few frantic minutes of communications between the divers and Topside, I noticed the shadow growing nearer. It was moving towards me. Topside, I found him. He reached down to grab my harness to drag me back to our dive stage. As he pulled me, I rolled over and got a brief glance at my surroundings. I had been on top of a pile of human bones. One of the strangest things I have ever witnessed happened on a body recovery mission. Even I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been the one in the water. The military had found a site in which they believed that bodies of several missing World War II sailors would be found. I entered the water with another diver with body bags to carry the remains. On bottom, we eventually found 3 skeletons. We placed them in the bags and returned to the stage. On our return trip to the surface, we saw the bags begin to move. Only slightly at first, then violently shaking and rolling, bubbles escaping from the 2 bags. Then they went still. The 3rd bag continued to struggle. We reached to the surface and sat down on deck, stripping our gear immediately. We were too afraid to touch the bags. But one of the tenders eventually unzipped the moving bag. An old, frail, very alive man rolled out coughing water. We stood up shocked, unable to comprehend what we were witnessing. Still not sure what I was doing, I ran to the other 2 bags and unzipped them. There were 2 old men lying motionless in the bags. They appeared to have just drowned. We attempted CPR, but we weren't able to revive them. The man, who was somehow still alive, was backing away from us, screaming the horrors that he had witnessed. He screamed about eternity spent burning. We locked him in a room and contacted the military, that we had found a survivor. Within an hour, a military chopper was hovering over us to pick up the 2 bodies and the survivor. We had placed the bodies back in their bags and handed them over. The men bent over to inspect them, unzipping the bags, and as he opened the bags, an unbearable stench overtook us. The bodies apparently began to decay, as if they had been dead and soaking in the water for I don't know, a week? He zipped it back up and had them lifted to the chopper. Then when we escorted him to the survivor, we could hear the screaming all the way down the hall. We opened up the door and saw blood splattered on the walls. He was alive and screaming, but he too appeared to have started decaying. The man calmly walked him to the chopper and lifted them on board. We never heard about him again. However, when I went back to examine the room, with his blood he had drawn these hieroglyphics all over the wall. I'm still not certain of what I viewed, but there were a few things that seemed to stand out. Waves, flames, and bodies. There was a tremendous amount of them on the wall, but shortly after I walked out, our supervisor began scrubbing the walls. He refused to let any of us examine it further. I've heard rumors about the Keepers of the Deep. I've wondered about them for quite some time. I believe that they were the link between many of these stories. Their myth within our team was seldom spoken of, but this is what I gathered over the years. We are not meant to roam the depths of the ocean, and when a diver loses his life in the deep, it doesn't stay that way. They're cursed to roam the oceans, and when they do find a living person, in an envious rage, they will bring you back to the depths from which they came. Before I share anything further, there are a few things I would like to clarify. I've received an astonishingly large amount of comments and personal messages since posting. Several people pointed out to me that there are very few people with experiences like these. And of those people, fewer could say they had recently left the job. Therefore, there are probably a lot of people out there who already know who I am, or that could just easily figure it out. That being said, I still believe everyone deserves to know. First, I'm going to answer some of the common questions I've received. Yes, I've experienced a lot of terrifying things in the ocean. But when you consider just how many dives I've made, these experiences are truly far and few between. Basic information about our dive gear. While it does vary based on the job, we do have a standard that we typically use. We're hard hat divers, meaning we wear helmets, not scuba. We have surface supplied air which runs down through the umbilical to the divers. The umbilical attaches to the helmet to supply the air. Woven in with the umbilical are our essentials. Without getting too technical, there is the supply air, electricity for a light, communications, and essentially what is a depth gauge. Additionally, we wear a tank on our back as an emergency gas supply. It doesn't contain too much though. It's just enough to get to the surface in case of an emergency. We don't use rebreathers for the work that we do. We do, however, occasionally use a full face mask instead of a helmet, or scuba if it's more practical. But it really rarely is. The Keepers of the Deep. I've never found information about them online. The only people I've ever heard discuss them are the members of my team. I've been told that other teams have had run-ins with them too, though. But even the guys on my own team are pretty hesitant to speak about them. I'll answer more questions as they come up, but I'll get back to why I'm really here. While I was working on an oil rig, we were using an ROV. Imagine a small remote control submarine to do inspections. We'd been hired to inspect for structural damages or deficiencies, after the rig had complained about abnormal vibrations. During the operation, the ROVs are tended from a line that offers power, a strength member, and transfers video and sonar images back to topside. As the ROV descended into the darkness, we began to notice thin scratches all along the surface. At first, it was barely enough to rip through the marine growth off the metal. But as we got deeper, the scratches turned to gouges. As we descended even deeper, we began to notice that the scratches appeared deliberate. We pulled the ROV up close to inspect, and there before us were, well, images. They were hieroglyphs carved into the metal, and they were fresh. The deeper we got, the older the carvings appeared to be. They were corroded and partially covered in growth. Whatever was making these carvings was working its way up from the bottom. Suddenly, the ROV stopped responding. It began shaking back and forth. We lost power to it. We tried to pull it up by its tending line, but it seemed stuck. Then we felt it. We felt it start to tug against the line. But it was coming from the ROV side. Something was pulling it deeper. 2 more guys jumped onto the line and struggled to pull it back up. The line began creaking, then broke. We pulled the remainder of the line up, but the ROV was gone forever. The supervisors were left with the task of figuring out how exactly to report our findings to the oil company. One incident took place about a year ago. During a salvage job, we were in the process of installing the rigging gear while facing the ship with my back to the ocean. I hadn't noticed anything approaching. Suddenly, something smashed into the tank on my back. Pretty hard. I was slammed into the ship, flattened by the force. I turned around and there was, well, nothing. I would later learn that I had a few broken ribs from the impact. After reporting it to the other diver and topside, we were told they were going to pull us. We got back onto the stage and started lifting toward the surface. We kept our eyes peeled, scanning into the not-too-distant shadows. During a decompression stop, we started to see a shadowy figure circling around us. We continued to monitor it as it circled closer and closer. We began to see it more clearly. It was a massive shark circling us. Now, I've never been afraid of sharks, but there was something about being circled by a massive shark in the middle of the ocean dangling from a chain that can instill a new phobia into the even bravest man. Keep in mind that we aren't in some enclosed cage. It's just a platform that we can stand on. It felt like we were being served up on a platter. It eventually circled close enough that we could see its features, but I couldn't recognize the species. It was bigger than a great white with an entirely different coloration. It was mostly black with a few gray features. It continued eyeing us while we sat there helplessly, praying to be left alone. By the time we completed our decompression requirements, it was close enough to touch. The stage lifted us out of the water. We were pretty relieved that the shark had decided not to find out how we taste. On the surface, we deduced that the shark lunged at my back and had only managed to hit the emergency gas cylinder. We did another dive, this time in crystal clear waters. There's something nice about getting a job in waters where you can actually see your surroundings. The visibility was over 100 feet. We got to the bottom and began to work. There were 2 missiles that had been ejected from a military aircraft and had not detonated. We were briefed on their location and told that they were not armed and would not detonate, provided they were handled appropriately. We located them much easier than we expected and began preparing to rig them. Just as I laid my hand on the first missile, my dive buddy said, "Ah, shit." My stomach dropped. I don't care how many times you've worked with ordnance, I sincerely believe you will always have that uncomfortable sensation in your gut and nervousness in the back of your mind. I looked up and realized that he wasn't talking about the missile. He saw a wall of sand rising in the distance. Hopefully just something in the current was kicking up the sand from the bottom of the ocean. The wall of sand was growing and was about 30 feet tall. Even worse, it was approaching us. Soon, it was upon us. It's kind of hard to describe what bad visibility does in the water. It's not a matter of not having enough light, it's a matter of too much shit in the water blocking the light. Imagine fog so thick, it's worse than anything you've ever witnessed. I'm talking about fog that you could have a flashlight pointed at your eyes from like an inch away and be completely blind to it. That's what bad visibility is in the water. The moment the sand hit us, we were engulfed in pure darkness. I placed my hand against my faceplate but couldn't even see that. After a few moments, we began to hear this metallic scraping sound. Then, as swiftly as it arrived, the sand was gone. We had crystal clear waters again. Except, there was no sign of the missiles. I had been within arm's reach of them when the wall hit us, but now even feeling around under the sand revealed no trace of them. The next incident occurred during a humanitarian job that we volunteered to perform. After a portion of bridge collapsed over 50-foot deep waters, we volunteered to recover the vehicles, and hopefully the bodies. By the time we arrived on the scene of the collapse, it had taken place just over a week ago. We spent the first day surveying the area and developing a plan to lift most that we could in that week time frame we had available. By the start of day 2, we had been actively pulling vehicles off the bottom. It was a difficult job to say the least, but not because of the effort requirement, but the state of disarray in the cars were just heartbreaking. These weren't military pilots or sailors lost at sea. These were families on vacation or people just commuting to work. It's difficult to say which was harder. The cars that we found with an entire family, with parents with their seats unbuckled, with them in the back seat trying to unbuckle their children, or the cars where the parents got out, leaving their children buckled up in the back seat. I tried not to imagine the panic that was going on inside these cars when the flooding broke through their windshields or windows, as people frantically tried to escape. But I couldn't forgive those who left their family to drown. Each day we moved to a new section of cars. And on the 4th day, we started noticing that several cars had their doors open and nobody inside. We were happy to have easier work, especially under the assumption that the tragedy had been lessened by people escaping the wreck. That is, until I began rigging a minivan for removal. The family inside here hadn't been so lucky. As I ran slings through the van and prepared it to be lifted, I noticed the other diver expecting the rigging gear. He began undoing one of my shackles. I asked him what he was doing, and the response was not what I had hoped for. "I'm just checking for bodies." I felt a familiar sick sensation in my gut. Slowly, I crept over to the diver and turned his body towards me. It resisted, but I slowly turned its face towards me. Its faceplate was fogged up, and I fought against my better judgment. I leaned in close, and to this day, I wish I hadn't. It was dark, but I could all too clearly make out the features. Rotting flesh. The person wearing this helmet had long since passed away. I lost my confidence and started to scream. My comms were blazing, divers and topside were trying to get my attention, but I focused on only one thing. I was scrambling backward away from him, but I had fouled my umbilical around the rigging gear in my state of absolute panic. The thing returned its focus to the minivan. I frantically cleared myself from the sling, and I noticed the telltale lack of bubbles coming from its helmet. It was opening the minivan door and reaching inside. As I swam away from the van, I watched it grab one of the passengers and drag him into the darkness. This was when I began to realize I might not be cut out for working beneath the seas. I continued diving for longer than I knew I should have. The entire time with this thought lingering in the back of my mind, I need to get a safer career. After my last post, I was contacted by my former diving supervisor. He told me the danger of sharing these stories online. Then his tone changed. "Things are getting worse down here." He had never spoken so freely about it with me, but he continued. "We had an incident last week, and we lost men." I was shocked. We all knew the dangers. We've seen the Keepers of the Deep, but nobody actually expects to die. After a close call or two, you just kind of keep having close calls. He continued, "Out of respect for our fallen, I need you to use your best judgment before sharing this, and realize that it isn't safe to share this story." Then he continued, "The team was contacted to perform a standard salvage operation for the military. They had been incredibly vague about the work, but indicated that a vessel had gone down. The dive team and their gear were loaded aboard a US Navy ship and escorted to the project. This is abnormal, but not unheard of. But things became more and more strange as they traveled to the project. First, they were briefed by the commanding officer. He reviewed the confidentiality agreement regarding our work. Then the brief was turned over to a man who did not introduce himself. He explained that the Navy had been working on a prototype submarine. Its capabilities and new technologies would not be revealed to us, and we all needed to know that it was tremendous. The size would dwarf any sub that we had ever witnessed. Then he admitted that the Navy did not need routine salvage work, but assistance in recovering their prototype. He briefed the team that 4 days prior that he had lost contact with the crew. Sonar images showed the submarine resting at the bottom, apparently intact, but nobody was responding to the communications attempts. As the ship arrived on scene, they found out that they were not alone. Nearly a dozen Navy ships were already awaiting their arrival. The divers were given the go-ahead to get in the water and begin work. Their first task was to inspect the submarine for damages and hazards. They needed to provide the bottom report for the engineers to develop a plan for raising it. They didn't want us rigging it however we seemed fit. They needed the prototype in as good of a condition as possible. The divers entered the water and were soon in absolute awe of the creation. It was like nothing they had ever seen. It was tremendous. From where they descended, they could not see the forward or aft ends of the submarine. The water was abnormally clear. In addition, the sub was created out of what appeared to be a reflective metal woven into scales. They began inspecting the sub for damage. After they had reached the maximum allowable time, they were brought back to the surface to swap out without any event. They reported to the next set of divers that they had explored the midshift and the aft, and found no apparent damage. The sub appeared to have been gently set down in the sand. The next set of divers entered to inspect from midship to the forward end. They began advancing while inspecting for damage. After about 10 minutes into the dive, one diver began tapping on the hull. Immediately, both divers reported that they could hear people inside of the submarine banging against the hull and shouting. They couldn't understand what they were screaming, but the message was pretty clear. They were terrified. The supervisor reported that they had found evidence that the crew was still alive. The divers continued to advance. It was about 5 minutes before their next report. There were carvings across the submarine's metallic sealed surface. Hieroglyphs had been carved into the submarine, and apparently they stretched from the very front of the submarine towards midship. Still, there were no signs of actual structural damage. Nothing that would cause the submarine to stop functioning. The divers returned to the surface and the commanding officer was given a full report on the day's findings. The team was assured that the submarine was capable of sustaining the crew. They were eager to retrieve it, but the crew was believed to be in relatively little danger. As day 2 begun, the divers descended with instructions to locate 4 specific locations. Engineers needed to verify that they were still structurally sound, for rigging attachments. Immediately, the divers reported that they could still hear the banging from within the ship. They began locating the rigging points quickly and pretty easily. Just within the region that was covered in the carvings, they noticed a figure moving about. They both saw it and there's no denying it, but it soon disappeared from sight. The divers were unable to figure out where the figure had gone. They both agreed to quickly find the last 2 remaining points. It was quick work. The 2 remaining points were located. All 4 were intact and readily available for use. As they readied to return to the surface, they were informed that there were 2 more locations that they were being asked to inspect. There were supposedly 2 hatches, port and starboard, that the engineers had insisted needed to be checked. The supervisor was pretty wary. The engineers up here got uneasy when they heard your report of something moving around the ship. They stepped away and then returned and insisted that you check out these 2 hatches. I'm not sure what's going on. They're being very ambiguous. Please be cautious. The divers returned to the area in question and began closely re-examining it. As they worked, they soon saw a figure emerging from the submarine. It was dragging a body out of the hatch. They froze and watched it push the hatch shut, and began dragging the body into the distance. Then they approached the spot and realized that the hatch was almost indistinguishable from the scales on the submarine. But it was there. As they were reporting this, the hatch began to open. Topside lost communications with the 2 divers. It was sheer panic. The tenders were reporting strain on the divers' umbilicals. The standby diver donned his helmet and prepared to get into the water. The umbilicals began violently shaking and pulling. The standby diver was pretty clearly terrified, but nonetheless approached the side of the ship and prepared to enter the water. The strain on the umbilicals was released. Suddenly, their lines went limp. A few moments later, air bubbles started erupting on the surface. The supervisor grabbed the standby diver and told him to get the divers and get the fuck out of there. He entered the water. He began tracing the umbilicals. His goal was to follow the umbilicals to the diver in distress. As he followed the umbilicals, he saw the air violently erupting from below, deeper and deeper. He reached the source finally. The umbilicals had been cut free of the divers and were pumping air directly into the water. Knowing the divers had no air supply, he urgently searched the area for the 2 divers. After about 5 minutes, he found nothing. He was ordered to go inspect the hatch. He frantically made his way to the hatch, hoping beyond hope to find the divers alive. As he approached, he saw the hatch was open and saw 2 bodies laying on the floor. He entered the space to retrieve them, and as he did, he noticed several figures in the darkness of the room. He grabbed the nearest body and began pulling it as the figures all rushed towards him. They were instantly upon him, tearing at him and his gear. In fear, he dropped the body and attempted to flee. In the struggle, he freed himself and rocketed to the surface. He was pulled up and over the ship unconscious. His bloody body lay on the deck, likely suffering from an arterial gas embolism from his rapid ascent. The team rushed him into the hyperbaric chamber to treat him. The supervisor informed the commanding officer that all diving was being terminated. He lost 2 men and another one was in critical condition. These were inexplicable things happening on this submarine, and he would not sacrifice more men. The treatment continued through the night, and the diver finally regained consciousness. He told the supervisor that he was done. He would not re-enter the water again. Ever. He was assured that nobody would be returning, and that as soon as his treatment was complete, the entire team would be returning to land. The next morning, the team was summoned for what was believed to be a debrief. They entered the room to speak with the commanding officer and his team of engineers. The CO asked them to have a seat. He then informed them that they would not move forward with the salvage of the prototype. However, what was down there couldn't remain. Whatever was inside of that submarine had to positively be destroyed. The team was to re-enter the water, plant charges in locations specified by the engineering team. The supervisor was furious. He demanded that the team be taken back to the mainland and released from the ship. Armed sentries entered the room and restrained him. The CO again repeated his orders, and clarified that the team would not be allowed to leave until the job was completed. Diveside was reassembled under the watch of several armed sailors. The supervisor continued to protest the job. After an hour of conflict, 2 divers finally agreed, under duress albeit, to get in the water and plant the charges. The 2 divers entered the water. Fearfully, they moved to the specified locations and began placing the charges. They began hearing banging and shouting coming from within the sub. The divers, understanding that these men would be killed, began sobbing. The CO came onto comms and began to explain to them that they would not be able to leave until the job was completed. After regaining their composure, the 2 regretfully continued. The 2 completed their task and returned to the surface. In their shame, they refused to talk to anyone. They left diveside. The ship began departing from the location and the team was again summoned. The commanding officer thanked them for their service to their great nation and informed them that they would be handsomely rewarded for the regrettable tragedy that they had encountered. He then went over the confidentiality of the job and everything they had witnessed. His final words to them were, quote, "Previous events have been leaked to the public. Please realize that there will be real consequences if any of this is leaked about what happened here today." The supervisor ended the conversation, and the entire team agreed that they were going to leave the diving company. Their fear of the deep sea, their remorse for the job, was all too great. He told me that there are some places man simply isn't meant to explore. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope the background noise wasn't too much. I had to keep the heater on in here because it is freezing. So cold. Let's thank the lovely patrons who are all listed on screen right now. Dan R. Neophyte, Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A, Daniel H, and Maximilian Charles P. If you want to help support the channel, please head over to the Patreon, become a patron, check out all the little rewards and whatnot. You can be beautiful and lovely and be a patron all at the same time. I know you can. Thank you guys.